In this mini lecture, we'll be talking about non-heterosexual identities and the challenges that individuals who identify outside of heterosexuality often face. Today, most college students are familiar with the LGBTQIA acronym. The University of California, Davis has put together an extensive list of terms and terminologies that are related to non-heterosexual identities. And before we get started today, I'd like to take a moment and look at some of the definitions that may be surprising to individuals who are not as actively involved in the LGBTQIA community. For example, lesbian usually refers to a woman whose primary sexual and affectional orientation is towards individuals of the same gender. However, some non-binary individuals also identify as lesbians, often because they have some connection to womanhood and are primarily attracted to women. Bisexuals are individuals whose primary sexual orientation is towards those of the same or other genders, or towards individuals regardless of their gender. For this reason, some people use bisexual and pansexual interchangeably. The Q in LGBTQIA refers clearly to queer folks, but it can also refer to individuals who are questioning. Questioning is the process of exploring one's own gender identity, expression, and/or sexual orientation. Some people also use the term questioning to name their identity within the LGBTQIA community. The T in the acronym refers to trans folks, but two-spirited individuals are also part of the LGBTQIA community. According to the definition put forth by the University of California, Davis, two-spirit is an umbrella term encompassing sexuality and gender in Indigenous Native American communities. Two-spirit people often serve integral and important roles in their community, such as leaders and healers. It refers to the embodiment of both masculinity and femininity, but this is not the only significance of this term. There's a variety of definitions and feelings about the term two-spirit, and this term does not resonate for everyone. Two-spirit is a cultural term, and it's reserved only for those who identify as parts of Indigenous Native American communities. Although the term became more common in the 1990s, two-spirit individuals have existed for centuries. Today, more people are familiar with asexuality than ever before. However, there's still some confusion as to what's meant when a person identifies as asexual. Asexuality is a broad spectrum of sexual orientations, generally characterized by varying feelings of sexual attraction and sexual desires for paired sexuality. Asexuality is distinct from celibacy, which is a deliberate decision to abstain from sexual activity despite sexual desire. There are many diverse ways of being asexual. A person does not have to experience sexual attraction, but may engage in sexual activities and still identify as asexual. Or a person may be only attracted emotionally rather than sexually to other individuals. One thing we know about heterosexuality is that it generally stands in contrast to a marked other. That's because in our society, there is a social stratification of sexuality, and heterosexuality, as well as being cisgender, is at the top. We've talked about social stratification in earlier mini lectures, but as a reminder, social stratification is the systematic ways society ranks groups of people in a hierarchy. Some groups have greater access to power, wealth, and privilege than other groups. Toppling structures of sexual stratification is clearly a goal of LGBTQIA activists.
However, within the LGBTQIA community, there are a number of other core values that often emerge. This includes intersectionality, or the understanding that community members might hold multiple marginalized identities and are impacted by multiple systems of oppression. The notion of critical love, which bell hooks defined as an extension of oneself and actions in order to nurture the holistic growth of another and the interconnection between us. The notion of interdependence is also important, and many LGBTQIA communities recognize that all people bring different strengths and experiences to collectively tackle complex problems. Thus, there's a focus on engaging in resource sharing and disrupting oppressive notions of professionalism, productivity, and individualism. Finally, many communities foster a sense of authenticity, where each member can fully exist as complex, multifaceted, and whole individuals. It's also important to talk about privilege and make privilege visible in society. We define heterosexual privilege as the unearned benefits and access to resources associated with the presumption that one is heterosexual. This is also true for cisgender folks who can access unearned benefits and resources because of the presumption that they are presenting or identifying in line with the biological sex assigned to them at birth. When we looked at the heterosexual questionnaire in the last mini lecture, this privilege became more visible. The funny thing about privilege is that it's often invisible to those who have it. It's only when we flip the script and question heterosexuality that we see this. One example of heterosexual privilege is simply not having to come out or justify or explain your sexual behaviors, desires, actions, or identity to friends or family. Individuals who identify and present as anything except heterosexual often face violence in our society, and it's a unique form of discrimination in the LGBTQIA community. Thus, it's a privilege to be unconcerned about homophobia or hate crimes solely based on one's sexuality. Much of the violence directed at LGBTQIA persons is an outgrowth of homophobia, the fear and hatred of homosexuals and homosexuality, anti gay attitudes and behaviors. Violence directed at LGBTQIA folks is a type of hate crime in that it's motivated by prejudice against a social group. Just recently was the 20th anniversary of the death of Matthew Shepard. He was a college freshman in Wyoming in 1998 when two men he had met earlier in the evening abducted, robbed, pistol whipped, tied him to a fence, and left him to die in the freezing weather. While he was found alive 18 hours after the incident, he died in a hospital 6 days later on October 12, 1998. His death ultimately resulted in the Matthew Shepard and James Beard Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which extended earlier federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. Just a note, James Beard Jr. was a black man who was murdered in the same year by three white supremacists in Texas. Another form of violence and hate crime directed at LGBTQIA individuals is corrective rape. Corrective rape is the sexual assault of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans individuals as a means of curing them of their sexual orientation. If homophobia puts a spotlight on a person's sexuality, another form of discrimination can come from the erasure of one's sexual self. In fact, bisexual individuals experience high rates of being ignored and rendered invisible by both the heterosexual world and some lesbian and gay communities. Many argue that bisexual erasure is a continuous struggle for bisexuals, as the existence or legitimacy of bisexuality, either in a general or in regard to an individual, is questioned or outright denied. For example, a female female married couple that spends time in a lesbian friendly space might find they experience bisexual erasure when one woman identifies as bisexual and is told that she is actually a lesbian because she's married to another woman. Research has found that this type of discrimination is correlated with a number of health disparities. In fact, according to the Bisexual Resource Center and GLAAD, bisexuals face higher rates of anxiety, depression, and other mood disorders when compared to heterosexuals and gay and lesbian folks.